The wagon was found at the edge of the tree line just before sunrise on the morning of October 11th, 1889. The horses were still hitched to it, calm, well-fed, and standing exactly where their owner had left them the night before. The lantern on the driver's bench was still faintly warm. The bedrolls in the back had not been slept in. 2 rifles lay wrapped in oilcloth beneath the seat. The ledger, still open across the footboard, listed the names of 34 paying guests who had crossed onto the Marsh property in the 2 years the boarding house had been open. Every one of them had been recorded arriving. Not one had been recorded leaving. The guide who found the wagon did not walk any closer to the house. He turned his team around, rode 14 miles back to the nearest telegraph office, and sent a single sentence to the sheriff in Roslyn. It read, quote, "They are all gone and the house is still warm." End quote. Before we dive in, press subscribe and let us know where in the world you are watching from. The Cascade Range in the autumn of 1889 was a working landscape of logging camps, mining claims, and rail crews pushing the northern Pacific through the passes. Small hotels and roadhouses had appeared along the wagon roads to serve the men who moved through that country week after week. It was in this landscape, roughly 9 miles north of the tiny settlement of Clay Elum in what was then Washington Territory, that a boarding house appeared on the maps of the Kittitas County Surveyor's Office in the spring of 1887. The listing was brief: Marsh boarding, twin proprietors, 40 acres, riverbank access, room for 12. The county recorder did not include first names for the twins because none had been given to him. They were listed only as the Marsh brothers. The 2 men who ran the house were, by every surviving account, plain in appearance, of average height, thin at the shoulders, dark-haired, quiet, and identical, to the point that neighbors at the nearest logging camp, 4 miles south, admitted they had never been able to tell them apart. When they spoke, one always finished what the other had begun, so seamlessly that a traveler passing through in the summer of 1888 wrote in a letter to his sister that it was, quote, "as if I were being addressed by one man who happened to occupy 2 bodies." End quote. That letter is one of the few surviving descriptions of the brothers written by someone who then left the property alive. The house itself was 2 stories, built of hand-hewn cedar, with a wide porch and a stone chimney at each end. There was a stable, a smokehouse, a root cellar cut into the hillside, and a long, low outbuilding the brothers described to the county assessor as a curing shed for venison and elk. The property had one thing that made it valuable to travelers, and one thing that made it strange to the men who worked the timber nearby. The valuable thing was the hot spring, a natural mineral pool about 100 yards behind the house. Loggers, rail workers, and passing families would pay 25 cents for a night in a bed and the use of the spring. The strange thing was that no one who worked the surrounding forest had ever seen the brothers hunt. The curing shed always seemed to have meat hanging in it. The smokehouse always seemed to have a fire going. But the twins were never observed in the woods with a rifle, and they never bought livestock from any of the ranches within a day's ride. The first guests to disappear were a father and son from Tacoma. Their names were Harold and Lucas Bream. Harold was a 39-year-old surveyor employed by the Northern Pacific, and Lucas was 15. They stopped at the Marsh house on the evening of June 4th. 1887, paid for a single room, ate a supper of stewed rabbit and cornbread according to the entry Harold made in his field journal, and signed the guest ledger. Below Harold's neat surveyor's hand, in a different hand, one of the brothers had written the words, "Paid in full," and drawn a small horizontal mark next to Lucas's name. The Breams were expected in Ellensburg 3 days later to meet a rail foreman named Callister. They did not arrive. Callister assumed weather had delayed them. Harold's wife in Tacoma did not learn her husband was missing until September, when a letter she had sent to the rail office came back marked unable to deliver. By the winter of 1887, 4 more travellers had failed to complete their journeys after last being recorded at the Marsh house. A cattle buyer named Emmett Rowe, a young couple named the Kestrels who had been heading to a homestead claim near the Yakima, a prospector named Silas Whitten, who had been carrying roughly $280 in raw gold. None of them reached their next destinations. The Cascades in that decade swallowed people regularly, and no one connected these disappearances to each other. The only person who noticed that all of them had last been recorded at the same boarding house was a clerk at the Clayelum General Store, a man named Jonas Field, who kept an informal ledger of travellers passing through his shop. Field wrote a short note to the sheriff in Roslyn in February of 1888, pointing out the pattern. The sheriff, a man named Ollie Buckner, wrote back that 4 missing travellers in 6 months was not unusual for the range, and that he would look into it in the spring. He did not. The spring and summer of 1888 brought 11 more guests to the Marsh house, who never appeared anywhere afterward. A family of 4 travelling from Walla Walla, the Halversons, husband and wife, and 2 boys aged 7 and 10. 2 brothers from a played-out mining operation near Blewett Pass, carrying the last of their season's gold. A travelling seed salesman named Kurt Ammon. A young woman named Eula Vance, who was travelling alone to meet a fiancé in Seattle, carrying a small carpet bag, a photograph of her mother, and a silver locket. 2 loggers on a week of paid leave. A widowed schoolteacher named Constance Ely and her 9-year-old daughter Ivy. Every one of them signed the ledger. Each was recorded paid in full in the same second hand. And then, without exception, they simply ceased to exist in any record kept by any other town, agency, family, or employer in the Pacific Northwest. Jonas Field wrote a second letter to Sheriff Buckner in the fall of 1888, pointing out that he could now count 15 travellers who had disappeared after last being recorded at the Marsh house, and that this was not a pattern the range could reasonably account for. Buckner rode out to the Marsh property in October of 1888. Buckner's report, which survives in the Kittitas County archives, is brief and strange. He wrote that he arrived at the property in the late afternoon and was met on the porch by both brothers, who invited him inside and offered him coffee. The house, he wrote, was clean and quiet. He asked about several of the missing travellers by name, and the brothers answered each question calmly, stating that yes, those guests had stayed at the house, and yes, they had left the following morning as planned. Buckner wrote that he ate a supper of what he described as, quote, well-roasted meat, unfamiliar in flavour but not unpleasant, end quote. He stayed the night in one of the upstairs rooms and slept badly. He woke twice to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and on each occasion the hallway was empty and both of the brothers' bedroom doors were closed. At one point during the small hours, he was certain he heard a woman's voice from somewhere in the house. And then, in the last paragraph of his report, he wrote a single sentence that has puzzled every historian who has read the file since. He wrote, quote, I do not intend to return to that house, and I will not send another man there in my place, end quote. Buckner filed no charges. He rode back to Roslyn the following morning and, according to his deputy's notes, drank steadily for 4 days. Jonas Field kept writing letters. He wrote to the Territorial Marshal's office, the Northern Pacific Rail Company, and the Tacoma newspaper. Most were ignored. Through the winter of 1888 and into the spring of 1889, 10 more travellers signed the Marsh ledger and were never seen again. A German immigrant family of 5, a pair of federal timber surveyors, a photographer from San Francisco who had been documenting the rail construction, a travelling doctor named Ephraim Lyle. The doctor's absence was the first to draw a real response. He had been due to deliver medical supplies to a camp near Clayelum on April 22nd of 1889. When he did not arrive, the camp foreman, a stubborn Welshman named Owen Price, sent 2 men to trace his route. They reached the Marsh property on April 27th, spoke to the brothers on the porch, and were told the doctor had stayed one night and ridden east the next morning. They did not enter the house. Owen Price did not believe it. He began to make inquiries of his own. Price is the man history should credit for what happened next. He was 51 years old, had lost a son to a logging accident in 1884, and had, according to the men who worked for him, no capacity for being lied to. Field sent him copies of every letter he had written to Sheriff Buckner. Price read them, added the names of the doctor and the 2 timber surveyors to the list, and realized he was looking at 32 vanished people in 24 months, all last recorded at a single 40-acre parcel of land 9 miles north of Clay Elam. On May 3rd, 1889, Price rode to Roslyn and confronted Buckner in his office. The conversation was overheard by the deputy, a young man named Elias Corwin, whose notes are the reason we know how it went. Price demanded a formal investigation. Buckner refused. Price asked Buckner what he had eaten in the Marsh house in October of 1888. Buckner went white in the face and told Price to leave his office. Price left. He did not stop. Through the summer of 1889, Price built a case entirely on his own. He rode to every rail camp, every logging operation, every mining office, and every homestead within 100 miles of the Marsh property. He wrote to families in Tacoma, Seattle, Portland, and Walla Walla, and he received replies from most of them. He compiled a list of 34 missing persons, all last recorded on the Marsh ledger, spanning June of 1887 to August of 1889. He was preparing to take this list to the territorial marshal in Olympia in the second week of October. He did not need to. On October 11th, a wagon guide named Aaron Klepper, who was hauling a small load of dry goods to a homestead near Blewett Pass, stopped at the Marsh property intending to spend the night. What he found is the beginning of the record I read to you at the start of this video. The lanterns still faintly warm, the wagon at the tree line, the ledger open on the footboard, the horses calm and well fed, and the house, when he approached it in the grey light of dawn, absolutely silent. Klepper did not enter the house. He rode to the telegraph office. Sheriff Buckner, whatever his reasons for his year of silence, responded quickly this time. He assembled a party of 7 men, including Owen Price, Elias Corwin, and a physician named John Marston from Roslyn. The party reached the Marsh property in the afternoon of October 12th. What they found has been described in Corwin's field notes, in Marston's clinical observations, and in a formal inventory made by a Kittitas County deputy named Wallace Prine. The house was empty of living people. The fires in both chimneys were out, but the ashes were still warm. On the long dining table in the main room, 12 places had been set. 12 plates, 12 cups. Beside each, a knife and fork laid parallel. The plates were clean. No food had been served, and yet the table had been laid as if guests were expected within the hour. In the kitchen, a pot of stew hung over cold coals. Marston, a Union Army surgeon who had served at Antietam and Cold Harbor, described the contents of that pot in his notes with a clinical restraint that has, to this day, kept his observation out of most published histories of the case. He wrote that the meat in the stew was, quote, unmistakably of a kind he had encountered only in his surgical training, end quote. He did not elaborate further. He did not need to. Corwin's notes describe the main room in careful detail. A grandfather clock still ticking. A book of sermons open on a side table, face down, held at the spine by a small pewter weight. A shawl folded on the back of a rocking chair. A child's carved wooden horse on the hearth, its paint worn in the places a small hand would have gripped it. Every object in that room was ordinary, and every object, catalogued later against the personal effects of the missing, was matched to a specific guest. The book of sermons had belonged to Constance Ely. The carved horse had belonged to her daughter Ivy. The shawl had belonged to Eula Vance. The brothers had not disposed of what their guests had brought with them. They had arranged it. They had made the interior of the house into a kind of catalogue of the people they had killed. The party moved to the outbuildings. The curing shed contained no venison and no elk. It contained rows of hanging shapes wrapped in cheesecloth, some of them still damp. Prine's inventory lists them in a numbered sequence, 1 through 19, without describing what they were. Marston later told his wife, in a letter donated to the Washington State Historical Society in 1946, that he had recognized the shapes and had asked Prine to burn the shed as soon as the count was complete. Prine did not burn it. Marston refused to eat meat of any kind for the rest of his life. The smokehouse contained bones. Prine's inventory counts 347 distinct pieces, all of which he crated and shipped to the territorial coroner in Olympia. The coroner's report, completed in December of 1889, concluded that a significant portion of them were human, that they represented a minimum of 19 individuals, and that most showed evidence of butchering with knives consistent with the ones found in the Marsh kitchen. The report did not attempt to identify specific victims. It could not. There was too little left. The root cellar contained personal effects. A pocket watch engraved with the initials HB matched to Harold Bream. A silver locket belonging to Eula Vance. A doctor's satchel that had belonged to Ephraim Lyle. A tin box containing raw gold weighing approximately $270, believed to be the payload of Silas Whitten. Prine's inventory lists 31 distinct items belonging to 27 of the 34 missing travelers. The remaining 7 were represented only in the smokehouse. The upstairs contained the brothers' quarters. 2 beds, identical, made up neatly, unslept in. A wardrobe containing 2 sets of identical clothing, arranged in identical rows. A wash basin with fresh water in it. And on the small writing desk between the 2 beds, a single sheet of paper on which someone had written, in a hand that matched the second hand from the ledger, a short passage. It read, quote, "They came to be fed, and we fed them, and they became feed, and now the feeding is finished." End quote. No signature, no date. Nothing to explain where the brothers had gone. The Marsh brothers were never found. The search parties that combed the surrounding forest through the last weeks of October and into the first snows of November of 1889 turned up no bodies, no tracks, and no camps. The hot spring behind the house was drained and searched. The river was walked for 4 miles in each direction. No one who matched the description of either brother was seen boarding any train, purchasing any ticket, or crossing any territorial line. In January of 1890, a lumberman working a claim near Stampede Pass reported seeing 2 identical men walking single file along a ridge at dusk, moving north, carrying no packs. He did not approach them. When he returned with 2 other men the following morning, there were no tracks in the snow. 2 similar sightings were logged in the spring of 1891. Neither was corroborated. By the winter of 1894, the sightings had stopped entirely. The house was burned to the ground by federal order in the spring of 1890. The 40 acres were withdrawn from settlement and eventually absorbed into what became the Wenatchee National Forest. No structure has been permitted on that ground since. If you drive the Forest Service roads north of Cle Elum today, and if you know where to look, you can still find the 2 stone chimneys standing in a small clearing, about 100 yards from a hot spring that continues to bubble up from the rocks exactly where the brothers built their bathing house. Federal fire crews at the time reported that after 3 days of steady burning, the 2 chimneys were left standing plumb and clean, while the rest of the house had reduced itself to a shallow pit of ash. Local rangers do not encourage visitors to the clearing. They will tell you, if you ask, that the horses of the mounted patrol will not walk into it, and that the dogs of the search and rescue teams will not enter it either, and that the reason is not something the Forest Service has ever put in writing. Jonas Field closed his shop in the spring of 1890 and moved to Portland. He never spoke publicly about the case. Owen Price returned to his work and lived another 11 years. When he died in 1900, the list of 34 names was found folded in the front of his Bible. His will requested that it be buried with him. It was. Sheriff Ollie Buckner resigned his post in December of 1889, moved east to Spokane, and drank himself to death within 18 months. Elias Corwin kept his notes in a locked box in his home for the rest of his life, and it is from that box, donated to the State Archives in 1932, that most of what you have just heard was reconstructed. Dr. John Marston practiced medicine in Tacoma until 1911 and refused, without exception, to discuss what he had seen in the Marsh curing shed. The final unanswered question of the Marsh case is not what the brothers did to the 34 people who signed the ledger. The physical evidence answers that question with a completeness the human mind resists. The final unanswered question is who, or what, laid the 12 places at the table on the night the brothers vanished. No guests had been scheduled to arrive that week. The nearest settlement was 14 miles away. The wagon that brought Aaron Klepper to the property the following morning was the first vehicle to approach the house in 9 days. Whoever set that table did so before the brothers disappeared. There were only 2 brothers. There were, in the ledger, exactly 10 guests unaccounted for from the last summer's arrivals, whose personal effects had not yet been catalogued in the root cellar. 10 guests and 2 brothers. 12 places. If you drove out to the clearing tonight, and if you stood between the 2 chimneys at the hour the wagon was found, which the surviving witness accounts place at roughly 4 in the morning, you would be standing where the dining table used to be. And if you believed, as some of the older rangers do, that certain places record what happens on them the way a wax cylinder records a voice, you might understand why the horses will not walk in, why the dogs will not enter, and why the 2 chimneys, in the middle of a forest that has grown thick and dark around them for 137 years, are still standing exactly where the brothers built them, waiting for a fire that no one has lit since.